Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of the Conservation Burial Alliance's three-part series on financial sustainability for conservation burial grounds. I do want to note right away, as you already heard, this session is being recorded for future use and reference. My name is Amy Henriksen. I am the steward of Kokosing Nature Preserve in Gambier, Ohio. I am also one of the founding members of the Conservation Burial Alliance. I will be your moderator this evening for today's session, and you will be hearing from three other of our founding members of the CBA during this webinar. Freddie Johnson is one of the founders of Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery in Gainesville, Florida. Laura Starkey is the founder and executive director of Heartwood Preserve in Trinity, Florida. And Jeff Maston is a co-founder of Land Matters, a conservation consulting firm, and also co-founder of Blue Stem Conservation Cemetery in Cedar Grove, North Carolina. So today, in part one of this three-part series, we will be talking about the why, what, and how of financial sustainability for conservation burial grounds. We will try to focus on the financial organization, development, and management of conservation burial grounds, applicable, I should mention, to not only to startup organizations, but also to organizations that already exist. So we will also try to address the standards and guidelines that relate to financial management and sustainability. Just so you know, and so you can mark your calendars, parts 2 and 3 of this series will take place on September 21st and November 16th. Also Wednesdays from 5 to 6:30 Eastern Time. In part 2 in September, exploring our financial obligations, we will focus on a deeper dive into the details involved in both short-term and long-term categories of strategic financial planning. And then in part 3, the final installment in November, entitled Investments for Growing Endowment, Perpetual Care, and Other CBG Funds, we will address some of the ways that conservation burial grounds are implementing their plans in order to fulfill their perpetual obligations to the people that they serve and to the conservation land that they manage. We also did want to note that your questions and your feedback today will, and then ongoing after today as well, will definitely help us in shaping the second and third sessions of this series. So we definitely encourage your feedback, encourage your questions. We'll talk more. We will definitely have plenty of time at the end of today's session for questions and answers. By way of introduction and a little bit of housekeeping, I just want to share a few opening thoughts regarding what we hope to do today. First and foremost, it is worth noting that the first conservation burial grounds in the United States did not have a great deal of guidance, nor did we have precedents to follow. And our intent here is to try to assist others so that they do not have to struggle to reinvent the wheel. So having said that, it is not our intention to cover all of the standard business practices involved in financial reports, balance sheets, profit loss statements, etc. Our objective here really is to identify and share what we consider to be the important and vital categories of financial-based information that will help ensure CBG's success and financial sustainability. Also, definitely important to point out that even though we all share many common characteristics and definitely a unified overall purpose, combining natural burial with land conservation, we are all unique. And so each CBG has a unique structure, whether it's not-for-profit, for-profit, whether we have active, passive partners, etc. We all have unique organizational cultures, operational protocols, and of course, the state-specific cemetery laws, rules, and regulations that we have to abide by. So for these many reasons, much of the material that we will be discussing tonight and the suggestions that we will present have to be weighed for relevance to specific CPGs. And that's true, again, whether it be a startup organization or an existing organization. And then lastly, we will definitely work to keep our presentation under an hour so that we have ample time for questions and answers at the end. So if you could, throughout this webinar, please send your questions as they arise as a chat message, and I will be monitoring the chat window. And then we will do our best at the end to get to all of your questions. If we miss any questions, we will definitely not ignore them. We may save some of them for a deeper dive, as I mentioned, in part 2 or part 3 of this webinar series. So having said all of that, I will now turn it over to Freddie.
Thank you, Amy. So I think I'm going to discuss some of the whys, like why we're doing this, why financial sustainability for conservation burial grounds is so important. And we could come up with a lot of whys, but what I'd like to focus on right now is just 3 significant whys. The first being, as many of you may know, in our country, there's a long history of cemeteries being abandoned. Now, the history is the conservation burial is relatively new, so we're not talking about conservation burial grounds, but in terms of cemeteries in general, there is that reputation associated with cemeteries. And one can attribute that reality in the past, and in some cases still in the present, to a number of causes. But certainly a lot of them, whatever those causes are, ends up boiling down to insufficient funds to keep things going. And the process and competent financial planning and diligent financial operating procedures, these are fundamental things for the sustainability of any cemetery, but particularly for conservation burial grounds, which, we're a new paradigm, and, we still are going to be in the burial ground cemetery category, but we are indeed a new, fresh paradigm. And we want, this is one of the whys, we want to remain unproblematic in the way of abandoned cemeteries or not fulfilling obligations. So another why that is a good segue from there is the actual, as I mentioned, conservation burial ground as a choice for individuals and families. There's a lot of integrity right now that we've built on the conservation burial ground movement and culture. It's still new in our country and around the world. It's quite new. But anyone that's had any involvement with the evolution of this movement and what it's about, they'll readily tell you and confirm that it's extremely appealing, growing, and meaningful. So a lot of families that can express it even more enthusiastic, with lots of personal meeting, or those folks that have had family members or friends, they've experienced a conservation burial themselves. And the choice of conservation burial, it's quickly established a very distinct and beloved reputation. So all of these things are really, really important things that we do not want to deteriorate, and a big part of making sure that we keep doing what we're doing is to make sure that we plan financially and have sustainable plans. As the movement and awareness of conservation burial grows, which it is for sure, it is critical that the integrity of what it represents remains very strong. The rich benefits of choosing conservation burial run really deep and really wide. and that's for people and the planet, both. In order to maximize those valuable environmental and human benefits, it only makes sense for its cost to be as affordable to as large a breadth of the population as possible. And one of the things that we can help achieve that is for conservation burial grounds to plan and manage all of their financial related matters in a proactive manner, efficiently and diligently. Another why is actually related, but more distinct even, is the commitment to the perpetual conservation ground and the conservation easement that goes with it. So cemeteries in general, already thought of as a perpetual piece of land that is meant to forever be a memorial for those people buried there and for those people, friends and family that are often to follow there. But conservation burial grounds have not only that level of expectation from people and obligation, but this whole additional commitment is being made, which is associated with the perpetual land conservation easement. These obligations and commitment involve benefiting people, whole natural living ecosystems, and helping mitigate global warming. And once again, if you think about how important these things are, how meaningful they are, and they themselves being perpetual, and we want to sustain all those things, so we have to recognize that the fundamental necessity of having a solid financial plan, which includes also that plan's ongoing evaluation and monitoring. Next slide, I just want to mention now some of the priorities and setup, and here again, a lot of this is particularly important for startups, but from my experience, a lot of these things can be reviewed even after startup. And for existing conservation burial grounds, good to check in on a lot of these things. So the first is what type of operation do you want to be? What kind of structure business-wise? There's 501c3s, which many of you we're all kind of familiar with. Less familiar is the 501c13 nonprofit structure, which is explicitly for cemeteries, nonprofit cemeteries. And then there's for-profit structures, of course. And these choices that you make can make a huge difference in exactly how you set up your financial plan. And for instance, some states, their states are all different, but a lot of times you'll see some states will allow a category of cemetery to be exempt, or they'll have where you can choose a pre-need license in operation, or exempt, which is only at need. Now, the significance of that is that would be a good example of how you want to do financial planning, because if you're a pre-need, you can sell burial services pre-need before someone dies, then that's going to be at least one source of cash flow. Whereas if you choose only an at-need cemetery license, that means you can only take money for burials after death. Well, then you're going to have to make sure that that cash flow comes from, like if you're a nonprofit, it could come from contributions or other activities or events. But all of it needs to be considered in the startup phase. The land, a huge important part of the whole concept, also requires special attention in terms of, has the land been secured yet? Is someone own it and is going to be a partner? All the different possibilities need to be evaluated in terms of ownership or whether it's dual ownership. Also, that's where the use of a conservation easement comes in. That conservation easement could be owned by a whole nother party, or it could be one of your working partners. It could be gifted. In fact, the whole land could be gifted. The state statutes here again are very important to be connected in this consideration and evaluation. Some examples of how different it can be is, and I don't know all the details of Ramsey Creek, but the reason I provided as an example is South Carolina, if I'm not mistaken, when Ramsey Creek, the very first conservation burial ground in the US, if not the world, South Carolina had almost no really regulations in terms of cemeteries. At least that's what I've been told by Billy and Kimberly, which made it quite easy for them to start a what would be in the more or less for-profit private ownership. But then at some point they created this relationship with a land trust as a passive partner. Another example is where my experience, a lot of my experience come from, is Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery. And there again, the Florida laws allowed us to make a choice that worked for us, may not work for somebody else or a different combination of partners, but it worked for us as an exempt cemetery, where we did not take money before death, but at the same time, we had a land trust that pretty much worked really well with us in providing land for us to work with. And then there was also a third partner, which I'll speak to later. Depending on who the partners are for the ownership of the land, the timing of any private party or a nonprofit entity has to be considered in terms of the conservation easement, because if the conservation easement can, in those scenarios, be very important as to the timing, because there can be tax benefits. If you're not a nonprofit, then there may be really important tax benefits that need to be worked into your financial plan and the timing of how you do things. Also the conditions of the conservation easement itself can really affect your financial plan. It's really important to be involved with that enough to make sure that the details that you establish in it are not going to come back and be confounding to you in the future and cause problems, because maybe part of it was not thought out well and it's not feasible for your operations. Conservation burial grounds have and continue to create all different kinds of partnerships, unique partnerships. And, it's not something that is set in stone. We keep seeing more creative partnerships or a little different partnership. And all those partnerships are a part of what really make conservation burial exciting and interesting to different partners, and what gives it a lot of appeal for growth. And it's helped fuel their growth and expansion. Financial related plans should be addressed early as a part of the whole process of establishing a formal structure and your partners. Financial planning should be discussed among all the vested parties and make sure everybody's on the same page. Once again, it's good. I just want to mention some examples of like Amy is a part of Kokosing Nature Preserve and the Kenyon College, which is, there you have a university and a separate organization that's sort of a part of that organization that has the conservation burial ground. And I mentioned Ramsey Creek Preserve. They have a rather passive, for their conservation easement, a rather passive partner in South Carolina called Upstate Forever Land Trust. There are also in Georgia, some of you may have heard of Honey Creek Woodlands. There it's actually a religious monastery, that the Monastery of the Holy Spirit, which they have created this conservation burial ground called Honey Creek Woodlands, and there's a third partner there, I would imagine fairly passive as well, which is the Georgia Piedmont Land Trust, which holds the conservation easement. Other examples is nature organizations like Foxfield, who have a cemetery under nature 501. I think that would be a combination of a 501c3 and a 501c13, if I'm not mistaken. Some states even require any cemetery be a 501c13. Other states do not. Government entity involvement, Prairie Creek is actually a good example there, which I mentioned before. You've got a partnership of an organization, a nonprofit 501c13 running Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery. You've got a land trust partner, Alachua Conservation Trust, and then you've actually, since Alachua Conservation Trust owns most of the land, they can't hold the conservation easement, and so Alachua County Forever, the local county land conservation initiative, holds the conservation easement. So once again, it's really vital that we all of these this gets established early on, and that all parties in the partnership have a unified vision and also unified values, and really understand their mission and how they're going to work together to achieve it. I'm going to turn this slide is where Laura Starkey with Heartwood is going to take over. So Laura, take it away.
Thanks, Freddie. And thanks, Amy. I'm glad to see everybody here. I just want to go into this next slide talking about the major responsibilities of any conservation burial ground, regardless of your structure. But basically, our responsibilities are to the land, to the people that are involved, and to the financial health. So with regards to the land, with the perpetual care of a conservation burial ground, the long-term care of the land itself is basically going to be your conservation land management, such as controlling invasive species, protecting rare and endangered species, prescribed fire, so on and so forth. You must be sure that all of the conservation easement obligations are met. I know Freddie just mentioned this a little bit earlier, and that the cemetery is maintained with best practices. This goes back to the integrity of what we're doing here. Depending on your property and your facilities, you may also have just some conventional groundskeeping needs as well, mowing the sides of the parking areas or driveway. That's not so much conservation land, but just you still have to do that upkeep. So for all of this management of the land, the most common tool for cemeteries to pay for that care is what's called the perpetual care fund. Sometimes it's called the care and maintenance trust fund or the endowment care fund. So different states and different areas have different names for it. But basically this fund is what accommodates the future needs of maintaining the cemetery and its continued activities. In particular, down the road, after your revenue from your burials is minimal or even non-existent, even in other words, when the cemetery is full or nearly full and you've sold all of your spaces. So once the trust fund is set up, basically the way it works is a percentage of each burial fee. Typically it's 10%, it may be more than that in some places, or voluntarily more than that, is put into this trust fund. And then over time, it builds up its funds and it collects interest over this time. So it grows as a fund. And so many years down the road, it's a substantial source of revenue to be able to do your maintaining. So it's good to leave this fund growing as long as you possibly can financially. So you have other sources to do that maintenance costs as long as you can. Just it helps for the long-term sustainability of your organization, of your cemetery. So next we have the commitment to the people we serve. Many of our operating costs go toward maintaining the expectations of our patrons, our visitors, our passive recreationists. For example, we're keeping up hiking trails or roads, directional or informational signs, community events, tours, having docents or staff to greet your visitors. These obligations along with any other anticipated expenses, must still be evaluated and calculated with any of your state mandated plans to make sure that your CBG can meet their obligations with that plan. So, or if there is need to supplement that mandated plan. So if you're a cemetery that is licensed or permitted to sell burial plots, services, and merchandise pre-need or some places call it pre-planning, but basically pre-need, prepayment. In other words, prior to the person's death, the purchaser's death, you may also have a separate trust from the care and maintenance. You also may have a pre-need trust. Different names are out there for it, but basically it's a trust for the pre-need merchandise and services. So this trust fund holds a set percentage of the amount taken in from that sale. So for example, in Florida, it's 70% of the services you sell. For us, that would be the opening and closing fee, which is a service. It's separate from the burial space, the interment rights. And then it's also 30% of any goods that you sell, goods or merchandise. So for us, that would be our memorial plaque marker that the family buys. Once that person dies and they're buried, those services and merchandise are fulfilled, then that cemetery can receive back those trusted funds as a reimbursement. So some states require this type of fund, but regardless of whether or not it's mandated, CBGs need to be certain that they are always in a strong financial position to cover the services and products for which we've already received payment, but still remain obligated to fulfill in the future. So many of our purchasers, as you can imagine, are going to live many years after we ourselves, all of us here, are no longer operating the cemetery or no longer even alive. So future operators are going to need to be able to fulfill those obligations for us. So I want to note here that the cemetery licensing boards I refer to, some places maybe call them a commission, a cemetery commission, funeral and community cemetery services. They generally exist to protect consumers. And so they're really into they're coming from the perspective of consumer protection. So they're out there when you start studying your state's statutes and rules in regards to cemeteries and funeral homes, you're going to look at these and say, good grief, where do they come up with these rules and statutes? And when you think about it, as they're there to protect the consumer, you can see that a lot of these rules that seem pretty onerous, but they also are there to protect the consumer and the families. So as you get to know your state statutes and rules, it helps to keep that kind of perspective of consumer protection in mind. So now another piece is, now this may seem obvious, but there's also an inherent obligation, both legally and ethically, for your CBG to reserve and keep track of the burial sites that you're contractually sold to people. In other words, keep count of your burial spaces. Got this written down. This means that the CBG must have an accurate system of monitoring or locating or keeping track of its spaces, grave spaces. You need to keep track of the combined number of your occupied spaces that have already been filled with someone a deceased, your reserved spaces, and your prepaid grave spaces. Some places that don't do pre-selling, they have reservations like a reserved spot. So you're considering that as you're counting that. So you want to make sure that you're keeping track of these. This combined total number of graves has to always be fewer than your CBG's maximum allowed burials, because we're not filling up every space. As we know, we're filling up a minimum number in each per acre based on what your conservation burial grounds has stipulated from the beginning. And then the third area of responsibility is to use good financial sense. So basically, you're going to be building two budgets. We'll talk about that in a minute here, but the startup costs, if you're still in the planning or idea stage, you're going to have a whole set of budget of what your startup is. And then you're going to have an annual operating budget. Just what is it, the day-to-day, what does it cost to run the place? Together, these provide a working financial plan for your operations. So this typically will include a balanced goal of expected revenue versus expenditures. You want to hopefully balance out, at least eventually, how much you're spending and how much you're bringing in. and that will help you provide feedback for evaluating your financial health. I'll note that your state licensing board might require your financial projections as part of your receiving a license. In Florida, again, I'm referencing my experience, and as Amy said at the beginning, everybody's different, and so this may not apply to you in the same way. But for us, for Heartwood, we had to show 3 years of projections and be able to be really clear about how those startup years are going to be covered financially. Then the board really drilled down to make sure it was a realistic. We had to actually go back to the drawing board and come back 6 months later with a more accurate, more conservative projection. It's important to have ample funds to cover those first several years of operations. So you're going to want to consider what your pricing is going to be for your burial spaces, what you're charging the families, what it's going to need to be. If you're a nonprofit, if you're able to do additional fundraising, like what fundraising you're going to need to do to cover sales if they don't go as quickly as you expected. Even the most conservative guesses, may still be slower than that. Maybe, better than that. So you're going to want to make conservative projections. Really about your cash flow, you're going to need some sufficient funds to cover your cash flow to get you through those first years. And then, of course, bookkeeping. You just need good bookkeeping and accounting. You're going to need your financial statements, usually monthly. You're going to have an annual tax return, basically all the things that are required to run a business. So don't forget to think about just your day-to-day bookkeeping and your month-to-month bookkeeping and year-end accounting. So basically what we're going to do, what you want to do is you want to create a business plan. You're going to monitor that plan, and then you want to be nimble and conscious enough to adjust that plan. You need to be adaptable and updatable. So following and monitoring your plan protocols. An administrative list or a calendar is helpful to start developing systems and protocols to help ensure that whatever financial related plans a CBG has developed that you indeed follow them. The protocols should be as much as possible automatic and self-sustaining, so that when new people, administrative staff, board, etc., when they become involved, it's a smooth and accurate transition. I always liked, and I know Jeff mentioned this at the beginning before we started, that a lot of us have this, in case I get hit by a truck, I'm often saying to my staff, in case I get hit by a truck, and they're like, don't say that. I'm like, we're in this business. We know that these things happen. We need, or even if I don't, or someone else doesn't, at some point, someone else is going to be doing this work. And so we need to make everything clear that what's going on. So just being organized with your day-to-day stuff. So having an administrative calendar or some similar list of all your financially related obligations, what's to be done, when reports are due, payments that are due, that can be valuable. Needs to be responsible for visible for everybody who's responsible in that. And you need to, make it accessible for everybody to get to. You need to we'll need to all regularly monitor our financial plans to confirm that our expectations are being met. We want appropriate formal reviews to be done by affiliated committees, board members, or an administrative team. Some states are going to have an annual state required audit of the cemetery and extensive renewal process for your license, especially for pre-planning, pre-need sales. Again, because you're taking people's money and promising them to deliver on that after they're gone, then understandably there's a lot of responsibility to that, and so the state is going to do an extensive renewal process for that. For all your documents on that, and your contracts, as well as audits of the actual cemetery grounds itself. So, and then adjustments to your plan protocols. You want to monitor and evaluate them that might call for adjustments to that existing plan. So you would, any adjustments would be to revise the plan in the best interest of sustaining all of the benefits that the burial ground has to offer for their people's choice of what we're here for, which is natural burial and land conservation. Next slide. So we've talked a lot about what the need about the need for ample funds, a strong, realistic budget, and all these other details to include. So what exactly do we need to include in our financial plans? So we've put together a list of both a startup budget items and general operating items for your CBG, whether it's an idea still or it's existing or just getting going. So hopefully this will be helpful to a number of you, if not everybody, to include in your financial plan. So rather than trying to put in figures, because it's just varies so widely in everyone's situation, we just used dollar signs just to give you a ballpark figure, kind of like when you look at a restaurant review. Is it crazy expensive, or is this going to be not as much money? So so that, again, that's due to just the variations in size, structure, and different mandates that we have. So looking at the startup costs, we've got, of course, was mentioned earlier, the land costs. You know, you might be blessed with donated land that you already have in hand, which is amazing to have that, because that's such a huge cost. Otherwise, as you can imagine, the cost of land is expensive and just gets more expensive. So that could be anywhere from free to minimal, all to $4 dollar signs. Could be 10,000 or more acres per acre. A lot of land is going to need some prep work done. So is there junk on the property, trash that needs to be hauled off? Are there invasives that need to be bush hogged and clearing of brush or anything like that? So that's going to have some cost to it. Professional fees. There's so many professional fees that we've encountered, from your CPA, having a good CPA doing your taxes and your accounting, to legal counsel, your design work of your layout of your place, your engineering. So this can be from $5,000 to $30,000, much more than that, just depends. Site development of the land. This includes your driveway, your parking area, any buildings you may have, your maintenance, everything that's talking about developing the land. If you have a raw piece of land, then you're going to have some work to do on that. Surveying for creating your plat map for the actual cemetery spaces, cemetery area. That's can be costly, is doing the survey work. Structures. This part can be phased into some degree. You may not need to start out with any structures, but you want to at some point, and even if it's a building that doesn't go in for 5 years, it's still technically considered a startup cost. So you might want to at least have a budget for that, to know where you're heading with needing to build a building. The building may also be your need for your offices, or an office, a gathering space for families, bathrooms. It's really good to have facilities when people come out to visit your site, your property, and a chapel maybe at some point for services. Maintenance, equipment, and storage. Even though our areas are natural areas, you may, as I mentioned earlier, you might have some conventional groundskeeping needs, like you might need a lawnmower. Even if you're doing control burns and leaving shrubs everywhere, you may still need to have a conventional lawnmower to mow the edges of the driveway. Also, for your grave opening, are you using a backhoe, or are you hand digging all of the graves? So whatever equipment and tools you're going to need. Well, you need a golf cart. We have a lot of elderly people that come out to cemeteries, or people that are differently abled and cannot walk or hike up a mountain or a hill, or through heat and bugs out to the site, and they may need a golf cart. So think about that. Those are things that are going to be in your startup cost, or at least in your operating. And then we've already talked about the perpetual care trust fund. The setup amount for that can be either from just set up with whatever money you have, or it can be a minimum requirement by your state. In Florida, it's $50,000. On other places, it can be even more. So that's basically your seed money to begin the fund. The pre-sell trust fund setup, your pre-need trust fund setup. This can be anywhere from 0 to 50,000. I know Amy's mentioned up in Ohio, it was 50,000 to start their pre-need trust fund seed money. The licenses, fees, permits, this, it's may not be as much as some of these other costs, but it's still something you're going to need to budget. Branding, marketing, outreach, you're going to need to create a good logo, build a website, manage that website, design print materials. You don't want to skimp here. You don't want to look like too much like a homemade homespun. I mean, within reason. I mean, maybe in your area it might work, but just you may not want to skimp on that. So, but your website is really the first and best impression and location for getting that word out. People are finding all of our CBGs through the web, through the internet. They hear about it in a New York Times article, and then they're looking for green burial near me or natural burial near me. So you need a good website. And then your equipment, your cemetery management software, you're going to need purchase and setup of your cemetery management software can be pretty costly at the beginning. You don't necessarily need to get all the bells and whistles that a software company might have for you to sell that says buy. You might be like, we really need a website or a handheld device for every person that walks out there to see their hologram of their family. Well, you don't necessarily need that right off the bat. So if you can't afford it, then just hold off. But you're going to need some kind of solid system to manage your customer accounts, just the very basics. Next slide. So onto the operating costs, the staff salaries and payroll. Even if you have volunteers and have the most awesome volunteer community in the world, you're still going to need some paid staff at some point. I think this is just realistic. We all have to put food on the table, and not everyone has enough people that can just do things for free forever. So you're going to want to budget in your payroll, your staff salaries. Building maintenance, if and when you have any buildings, you're going to have cleaning, repairs, general upkeep. So once you have that, that's going to be an operating budget item. Groundskeeping and land management, you're going to have a wide range depending on what your land needs. But we talked about some of the startup needs for that, but you may have ongoing bush hogging needs, or you're working on eradicating or managing your invasives. All of your land management costs. A good land manager is going to be able to help you with what that's going to cost. You might contract that work out, or you might be able to eventually afford to have your own staff do that. But the first years, you may just be able to contract it or get volunteers for the first, to get you through the first part, but you're going to need to budget it as though you're going to have to pay for it at some point. Insurance, Florida, we're so litigious down here, it seems. I don't know if other parts of the country, but I just have the fear of insurance gods, the fear of God of insurance in my experience. So we've got workers' comp for our employees, which is always a good thing. D&O insurance if you're a nonprofit, liability in case something happens to someone while you're on the property, and property insurance in case something happens to the property. You have a fire, you have a flood or something. IT support, it's just helpful to have IT support for your computers and your website. I just used my IT guide just today because my camera for this webinar was not working this morning when we did our run through. So that's just helpful to have that, because your computer system is just really critical. Again, the cemetery management software that I mentioned earlier, even though you're doing a lot of startup setup for that, you're going to have ongoing annual licenses. You'll have to pay for that. So your marketing and advertising, again, you've got the startup costs for getting your brand out there, but you're also going to just need to do just ongoing outreach or marketing and advertising. There's a lot of low cost or free ways to get your name out there, but you may still want to do some advertising in the local newspaper or magazine that goes to people's mailboxes, because you may think that, oh, everyone's going to find us and they're going to be coming and flooding our doors because we're the best thing that happened, and it's finally got to this area, and then you're going to think all of the Native Plant Society members are going to immediately sign up. Well, they don't. They may say they're going to, but they may, a few of them will, but you still need to get the word out, so people still need to hear from you. So office supplies, well, that's going to be your basic office supplies, but you're also going to just need to have some good brochures and good forms, materials that a copier where you can print off the forms that people need to fill out when they're doing a purchase of a burial space. Folders of information that you give to families that are seriously needing to, get some information about what you're about, and they may want to confer with their family, so they need stuff they can take with them, and you're going to have print costs. As much as we want to do things without printing, we want to go more in the cloud. You still have to have business cards and maps and boxes of tissues, things, all kinds of things, office supplies. And then of course, taxes, accounting, and bookkeeping. We've drilled on that a few times before already. Tools and equipment, shovels, picks, rakes, lawnmower, bush hog, golf cart. Your smaller tools are going to need to be replaced regularly because rakes and shovels break, and larger equipments need repairs and maintenance. And then your utilities, you got electric, water, internet service, things like that. So a lot of this may seem kind of obvious, but in case it's not obvious, or you just were like not quite already thinking about that, I hope that was just a helpful hands-on, a practical list of things. I'm now going to hand this over to Jeff Maston to kind of pull this together with some better cohesion. Jeff.
Thank you, Laura. Well, we've kind of given you a lot to think about in terms of kind of the obligations, priorities, commitments to building an organization and a conservation burial ground. And one, an organization that's strong, Heidi and I at Bluestem use the word stout and survivable. Survivable beyond us, survivable financially, and really that's the key for what we're talking about today. So what we found, and this is our recent experience at Bluestem, is one of the best tools that was out there that really helped us get, really wrap our brains around what we were pulling together, and also be able to articulate it to just about everybody, was to really build a business plan. And we've said this once, we've said it more than once probably, that regardless of the fact that whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, you have to use good business sense, and you have to be able to articulate your message in a way that many different people can understand it. And a business plan is a great tool. Now, I'm not going to say that there's one specific format of business plan that you have to use versus another. What you're really trying to do is pick a business plan or a document that really speaks to your audiences, whoever it's intended to be. And you might have multiple copies or versions of your business plan, but nonetheless, it's building something that really enables you to discuss what you're trying to do, and to allows you to articulate it with in some cases fairly fine detail. The business plan is a way that can provide you bringing all of these pieces together: your financials, all of the assumptions that you build your financials on, your message, your strategies that you're hoping to articulate, all wrapped around your vision. And it's really meant and intended to, or can function to serve, your communications with your donors, the attraction of donors, your financiers, whether they be donors with your for-profit, if you're borrowing money, and really your community. The business plan can really serve all of these different roles. As Laura mentioned earlier, she even had to utilize her business plan to support her application and attributes of her business plan to support her application and her budgeting. So it's kind of a critical piece, and it's a pretty good backbone exercise for you, because it will make you ask a lot of questions. And once you do that, and once you've built it, and it's a hard work, quite honestly, you'll feel a certain level of confidence in being able to then talk about how the different pieces fit together. So a business plan should be built with the intended audience in mind. How do they want to receive the information about the project? What information do they need to answer the questions as they read your plan? How can you link together the financial assumptions of your sales projections, your burial projections with population and market analysis? That's a great outcome of your business plan. What's your vision for the site and how does it translate on paper? So in other words, what's your vision for your conservation burial ground and how do I articulate it to the community? Kind of regardless of your business model, for-profit, nonprofit, 501c3, 501c13, the business plan can be utilized for all of these different kind of outcomes, or different people can really be used to help you attract board members. They can really, as you're trying to bring people in to your organization, both as kind of contributing members, your business plan can really serve a role to really bring people up to speed quite quickly. And it really shows your professionalism and your depth of thought. Freddie pointed out earlier today, make sure that this document and all of these documents that we're talking about, and these budgets and all of these things, make sure that they're really built to be adaptable. The more you can use different tools like Excel, where you can create models and update this information, it just allows you to alter these things on the fly. You can start to actually test your model. You can test different pricing methodologies. You can test your sales forecasts. And with a couple changes within your business plan document, you can see your cash flow statements change. You can see your income statement and your balance sheets change. And that's all because of building something from the beginning that can be customized and adaptable. The work you put into your business plan will pay for itself, and it will help you build kind of your message and the means for taking care of your project really for the future. So, I can't say enough how important it is to do this. And it really will give you a lot of confidence in how you speak about your project and move forward. So at this time, Freddie is going to kind of wrap things up and then take us into our question and answer period.
Thank you, Jeff. So what you see on the screen now is Laura found this quote, which I think is really pertinent to our whole discussion. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Another Einstein quote. Gosh, he must have just sat around and did quotes all day. But I think it's very pertinent because really a lot of the things that are very much valued about conservation burial, very meaningful to people, that can't be counted for sure. I mean, we know it's there and it's huge, but you can't really count it in numbers very specifically. However, a lot of that is dependent upon planning and financial plans that can be counted and can be executed and followed. And really that's really foundational for us to get to the other. So they're mutually dependent. And I think in review of everything that we've talked about, a lot of this just boils down to some very important things. And that is, we're talking about caring for the land. We're talking about a people component of working with people and providing a lot of meaning to people in what we do. And then we're also talking about keeping to do that, which is our future obligations. And if you take those three things, they're all very much dependent upon financial sustainability. There's all different kinds of partnerships that can be formulated and that have been formulated. There's all kinds of state regulations. There's variances from state to state. There's unique characteristics in growing conservation burial ground, the whole movement and the different varieties of the way it's grown. But all of it really in the best interest of everything that we do and the goodness that we have to offer, early planning for and continued attention to all the aspects of conservation burial grounds financial sustainability. It's critical in all of these things. So I think the one big takeaway is to remember that what we're dealing with is perpetuity. So, and therein lies our responsibility and obligations. So I think, Amy, can you take over from here?
Absolutely. So thank you everyone for that. I think we have done our due diligence in keeping our comments to under an hour. So we definitely have time for questions and answers. I actually have not received any questions in the chat. So we have either so adeptly anticipated all the questions and answered them proactively, or we've overwhelmed with information. Okay, so we do have a question related to bookkeeping. So is QuickBooks adequate, or are there specific cemetery software packages, and are they worth it? I can start by answering for Kokosing Nature Preserve. As Freddie mentioned, we actually have a very unique situation in that we have a partnership with Kenyon College. So we are very fortunate in that we are able to rely on the Kenyon accounting office to do all of our accounting for us. So that's a unique partnership and is very lucky for us. We do not have any cemetery software management that we use, but I'll defer to Laura and Freddie to speak to what you're using in terms of bookkeeping.
For me, we use QuickBooks for our, payments of invoices to, places and things. But for our cemetery accounts, in terms of our sales to people for the burials, we use SimSites is the company that we use as our software, our cemetery management software program company that we use. And so that's where we put in, for example, when someone buys a space and we put in all of their information, how much they paid for the burial fee, burial rights, the opening and closing costs, and their marker are the three things we sell. And then if they're making payments, we can keep track of their payments and how much is still owed. We can put in all of the information about like the trusted amounts. We actually use commission for our sales to help as a way to pay for our staff. And so the commission, we keep track of that on there. So all of that type of work is done through SimSites. For us is the company we use. And then we do also use QuickBooks for just our, our operating, paying bills and things.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the specific question about QuickBooks, I think it's certainly fine. Probably, I can say that's what we use for all the formal accounting stuff, like profit loss and expenses and income and balance sheets. All of that is done through QuickBooks. It works fine. I don't know anybody that wouldn't use it unless they're just doing something on their own, much simpler, but it works really well in terms of Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery and has since day one. Sort of like Laura, we have our separate software program, which actually we for a good while used SimSites at the beginning as well. Now we sort of have our own custom software that's very specifically tied to all things related to burial, families' names and date of burials, and all of the paperwork involved with doing a burial or planning for the future. We have all that on a separate software program that works quite well, and they're not really integrated. They're separate, but it's not a problem, and it works quite well.
So I would say you kind of need both. You kind of need
Yeah.
two things. They're kind of two different categories of what they're doing for you.
Absolutely. So next question is related to sort of organizational structure in terms of 501c13 designation versus 501c3 or LLC. So what benefit, if any, has been experienced by those with a 501c13 designation?
Well, Jeff can speak to that as well, but really it's not, to a certain extent, in some cases, as I mentioned, in some states, it's the only way you can have a cemetery. And I think Jeff can tell you more specifically which states they are, but there's some of the New England states.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and let's just say, for example, if a land trust wanted to have a conservation burial ground, I think this exists. What's the land trust in Texas? Coastal Prairie Conservancy in Houston, around Houston, Texas. I may be a little bit off on this, but they wanted to start an initiative for conservation burial. So I'm not absolutely sure that they have a 501c13, but that's a really good example of how they might choose to have that initiative under a 501c13 instead of under their 501c3, which could create issues in terms of, what they're doing. And it would be like mission creep to a certain extent, and also maybe very confusing. But Jeff, I'll let you speak more to that.
Yeah, sure. The C13 category was built, it's an IRS code, so 501c3 is an IRS code. C13 is an IRS code specific to this. And I think it was probably built partially for some of those New England states and other states that do require some form of, they're essentially requiring a nonprofit, but the key with the 13 is that all of the revenue generated by the cemetery needs to stay in the cemetery. It needs to be utilized for the purposes of the cemetery. So whereas a C3 has flexibility when it generates revenue, where those revenues can go and how they can be utilized for programming and other things, a C13, excuse me, has to focus those funds on that particular cemetery. And so that's really probably one of the key, and I wouldn't say that that's a benefit. I'd say that that's a challenge, quite honestly. You can do a lot of the same things. In fact, you can do all of the same things with a 501c3 and not have the same restrictions. So, I think there are some C13s that started as 13s and somewhat regret that. When you sometimes, for example, if you apply for grants, you have to be a 501c3. Well, a C13 doesn't enjoy that possible revenue stream because they're not of that classification. So, we bring it up because it's important, and many states do, or some states do require it, but you really have a choice to make when you're considering that. And I personally see a lot of value in the C3 versus the 13.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will also make the point, however, that as Jeff said, both are nonprofit designations of the IRS. So if you are a 501c13, you can take, with few exceptions, but you can take tax deductible contributions from people and organizations. There are a few categories of donations, like when they come through a donor trust, for instance. The donor trust, and this may be a law, but if it's not a law, it might as well be a law, because if you're a donor trust, they cannot donate to a 501c13, it has to be a 501c3. But like if I personally want to donate to a 501c13, I have the same tax deductible benefit as if it were a 501c3.
Mhm.
So follow-up question to that, can religious cemeteries be either a C3 or a C13?
I believe so.
I believe so too.
Yeah, I believe so. But I think that's something to follow up with your, the cemetery law is very, very specific. And there are attorneys that actually focus on this part of the law. And it's we found it was worthwhile when we got to certain questions about choices like this, which are kind of long-term and pretty significant, forks in the road, that it's worth having a professional to kind of lay this out and really kind of run your concept by. So I would, none of us here fit in that category. That's a disclaimer. But there are folks out there, and they can be found. So anyway.
Very good. Next question is related to business planning and projections. So Freddie or Jeff, since you're fresh in this process, can we hear from a few folks on how they went about projections for future burials or revenue? So sales projections.
I can.
You're back, Laura. I thought we
I
lost
did. I
you.
came back in another doorway. Sorry. Sure enough, right? But at least not till the end. My computer froze up on me, so now I'm on my laptop. Yeah, for us, that was, again, this was now 8 years ago that I was doing this for us approximately, but I did find it was really hard to get sales projections to work with. And because again, there was nobody to use as an example. Freddie shared what their real stuff was in terms of how many their sales they were making, but there was a bit of an apple and an orange there because they did not do pre-need. So I would share with anyone that needs that number from what we've experienced, just because I know how hard it was for us to get sales projections. So I can't tell you off the top of my head what our projections were, but I know it was hard to find them because it was hard to find comparables.
So this is Jeff. We have recently just gone through this, and of course we have not started our sales, so we will see how well we have done. I will say this about it: when in doubt, be conservative. Make your numbers conservative. You can build a low, medium, high budget, and that's that nice part about being adaptable and being able to use spreadsheets and all these things. But at the end of the day, really consider the low numbers to be your starting point, because what you don't want is to overestimate and set yourself up with expectations of revenue that do not come to fruition. That without having a significant amount of available cash flow or external resources, that can put you in a really tough position. So that's the first thing I would say. What we did at Bluestem is we actually talked and we benefited from Laura and a lot of the other burial grounds that have come online over the last 5 to 10 years, to be able to look at those kinds of numbers, and to also you have to think about things like competition. You have to think about what's happening. Not your competition is not just conservation burial grounds. Your competition also includes local cemeteries or other choices other alternatives that people may have. Maybe green burial sites that don't fit under the conservation burial site. So you need to start looking at all of the kind of the market side of it and build your numbers with that. You have to look at the population. and look at things like percentages of people that may be interested in green burial within your region. And then think about the likelihood of you getting 1% or 0.5% of even those people, and really, create some assumptions and build those assumptions with hard numbers. And also there are a lot of statistics out there about trends and markets that are within the funeral or cemetery industry. You can find some of those facts. For example, what is the alteration of or cremated remains? Where are they today versus where were they before versus where will they be 3 to 5 years from now in the percentage of burials? If you multiply that times what your future numbers are for your cemetery, all of a sudden it changes your economics. So you have to kind of build all of that kind of information in together in a formulaic way. That's the way. That was our approach. I'd be happy to discuss that with anybody, but I also know that there's probably other ways in which people can come up with that. At the end of the day, conservative numbers, I think, will be the safest bet as well.
I think just to piggyback on that, on what Jeff is saying about being conservative, I think, and this may have evolved in the 6.5 years since we opened as a cemetery, but we thought we were just going to hit the ground running in terms of marketing. But what we found is that we really actually had to do a great deal of education about green burial. So it's sort of hard to sell something that people don't yet necessarily understand or even know is an option or is legal. So I think you have to consider too that you're doing a lot of educating first in addition to marketing.
Yeah, and Heidi mentioned one in a text to me one other factor, which is, when you're thinking about where your burial ground is going to be, like physically located, and people's accessibility to it, start to really consider things like your target market. Are you basing it by distance? Are you basing it on miles? Whatever it's going to be, who's living in that region? How are you accessing those people? What information, does things like education play in building the kind of the communications? Are you in an area where people are already doing and thinking about green burial? Are you new to that? And all of those are influencing factors that will change whether your projections where they should be on the scale or on the spectrum.
So moving to a different question, interested in hearing about the kind of constructive partnerships you and or others currently enjoy beyond, I think we already talked about some bookkeeping, accounting, software type relationships, but other kinds of constructive partnerships.
Well, I'll start that, and I know I'm talking too much, but I'll do that anyway. There's another, Freddie mentioned a bunch of really interesting ones, and with conservation burial, one of the natural fits is going to be having a conservation organization as one of your partners. There is a partnership that's trying to build a conservation burial ground in Massachusetts. So there's an organization called Green Burial Massachusetts. They partnered up with a land trust. So the land trust is looking for and helping buy the land. And the Green Burial Massachusetts wants to be the owner and the operator of the burial ground. So you have this really interesting thing where land trusts sometimes really don't want to be, I think Freddie talked about passive versus active roles. Land trusts in many cases don't want to be actively involved, but they're happy to be passively involved. And then you have an organization, the operator And in this case, in Massachusetts, Greenbury, Massachusetts, they want to actually be the owner and operator of the burial ground. So it's this really interesting fit of and good utilization of mission for both organizations. The key is that they come at this with similar value systems. And the value systems to me is a critical kind of point of knowing when we get to decision points, we're all coming at this from the same place. So regardless of what happens, we know that we're thinking about this this activity in the same way, under the same with the same kind of value system. That's the critical piece for any of the partnerships that I think that develop is, are they coming at this from the same value system?
Yeah. Also, I'll add to that in terms of, I'm not sure if the question related to this, but what Jeff is talking about, or what he spoke to, is sort of the structural partnerships, which we've been mentioning in terms of like from the very beginning, or structural in terms of your ongoing operations and everything about you. But there's also other partnerships that can be extremely meaningful and helpful. For instance, Prairie Creek Conservation Cemetery has over the years built partnerships with different hospices, with universities, with other environmental organizations, and not to belabor it, but those are all really important when you start talking about your projections, because they're all going to be helpful in promoting your startup and ongoing success. So I'll just mention there's tons of those out there, and the community itself can be a partnership. At Prairie Creek, we have a whole designation called the Society Pick and Spade Society that one of our founders, Hutch Hutchinson, started. Have their own t-shirts. You can't get the t-shirt unless you help dig a grave for a number of times, and you know, that really is a community partnership, and it has been very strong and ongoing, very meaningful to not only the organization but to the people involved.
Very good. So this was actually Michael Mayer's question, and he's asked what I think is probably a related question in terms of saying that the biggest challenge they face as a conservation cemetery soon to launch, with significant pre-need sales in place, which is great, relates to funeral services. So home funeral assistance and transport services required by client families. Any thoughts? So I was just thinking in terms of other partnerships I already mentioned, we partner with a land trust, we partner with a college, but also partnering with funeral homes, partnering with end-of-life doulas has been significant for us. And we are fortunate enough, we live in a very small community, but we are fortunate enough to have an end-of-life doula here in our community. So that has been significant to us in terms of helping with those home funeral services. Anyone else in terms of thoughts on how to address that partnership with funeral homes and end-of-life doulas?
I think it's very much dependent upon, you know, location, situation, and it's hard to apply, you know, advice from one area that might be entirely different from where this situation is. So, but just generally speaking, I think a lot of it does go back to education and finding, as you said, Amy, finding partners that can recognize that natural burial, I mean, now natural burial, which, you know, conservation burial is natural burial, it's much more, but it's natural burial. And if you just look at the growth of natural burial and the interest in natural burial, anyone that's in the death care industry should be embracing it. And it's growing from two different areas. It's growing from who would have, people like me who would have or previously chose cremation as their body disposition choice, but very quickly, without any hesitation, switched over as soon as it was available. And then it's switching from people that want some kind of burial, not cremation, but they're definitely easily switched over to natural burial from vault burial and everything that goes along with it. So anyone in the death care industry actually has opportunity there. And after all, for funeral homes, it's really what they were originally about before cremation even came around. So I think a lot of it is education and actually going out there and making those kind of partnerships based on the reality of where things are, what's happening and the way things are going. It's pretty overwhelmingly going in a natural direction. Yeah.
If I can comment on the about Michael's comment or question, for us at Heartwood, we're right on the edge of the Tampa Bay. We're on the side of the Tampa Bay urban area, and for us, we have found that we've got a lot of really, a much longer list of funeral homes willing to work with us and provide funeral services, natural burial, and learn about it and serve the families than I probably thought we might have had. So again, if you're maybe in a more rural area where there's not as many funeral homes and they are more traditional and there's people not as willing to provide green burial services, or you're wanting to avoid working with funeral homes altogether for funeral services, I can't speak to that, but for our experience, we had a lot more funeral homes. We have a really nice long list, and it grows, each year. So of people that we have worked, of funeral homes we've worked with, and a lot of younger new funeral directors that are younger, more women in the field. It's changing from a male-dominated field to a lot of new young women funeral directors and men, but that are very interested in what we're doing. And so it's been a pleasant surprise for us to find that we've had a really good response from funeral homes. We haven't had, when people ask like, well, do I have to have a funeral director? Do I have to have a funeral home? And then we say, you don't have to, but you do need to make sure somebody can do all of the stuff that is required by law, to do the stuff in place of that. And so far, we have, in 5.5 years, we haven't had anybody take us up on that to say, okay, yeah, I've got, they'll say like, they don't want to have it, but I'm like, well, who's going to be doing it? Well, my son. Well, is he willing to? Oh, no, he would never, so it's not, so for us, it comes back to, for our market audience or market, so far, it could change. We could have someone doing it on their own at any time, but and we'd be willing to work with them. But whenever we've explained that to people, it's been, so therefore our funeral services have all gone with funeral homes, and it's been a good relationship with many of them, most of them.
Very good. And a question related to an operating expense. Is it more expensive to maintain cemeteries that have individual markers, even if they are flat markers? Or does the grass simply grow around the stone, but not over the stone, and therefore no incremental work? I'll answer that for Kokosi Nature Preserve. For the stones that are there, we allow families to keep the area right around the stone clear if they so wish. But we do not do that for them. So over time, the prairie will just sort of reclaim that space, and the stone will not be obviously as evident as the years go by. So that's our approach. So no incremental work or expense for us. Anyone else want to add to that?
Prairie Creek is similar to that, with the exception of we do regular site checks. Like Laura spoke to earlier, is we have a responsibility to make sure that We know where every burial space is. And so we have this sort of revolving site check, and the marker, when we do these site checks, revolving site checks, if the marker is covered up with earth or missing, we make sure we find it or replace it. What we use at Prairie Creek is a brass survey marker that's hand stamped, and it's anchored with rebar into the ground. So it is not a huge thing. We are not doing maintenance or around it or on the grave, but we do make sure, unless someone particularly, which occasionally happens, someone says they do not want any marker. In that case, we just make sure we know where it is and make note of it on a GPS. And but it's minimal. What we do is minimal.
I feel compelled to add that we do have GPS coordinates for every corner point for every lot at Kokosing Nature Preserve. So marker or no marker, visible or not, we are able to locate those graves.
Same, yeah.
The only thing I'm going to add to, and we're not operating yet, so I probably shouldn't add too much, but the excuse me, some of this is based on how you design your burial ground and how you plan on operating. And so you're going to create rules on exactly these things. What happens when a tree falls? What are we burying in the grassland? How are we managing those grasslands? There are burial grounds, for example, that mow their grasslands. They're once a year, kind of like haying. There are those that use fire. So some of the response to answer this is it really kind of depends also on how you operate individually and the choices that you make and what you allow the public to do within your burial ground.
Very good. We don't have any other questions, but Cassie Barrett from Carolina Memorial Sanctuary is also on the call and had a couple of responses. So are you able to unmute, Cassie?
Yeah, there's just a airplane going by, so it might be, I hope you guys can't hear, it might be loud for a second. The thing that I was going to comment on when we were talking about sales projections is that something that, to be totally honest, that we just didn't consider very deeply because we were in startup mode for several years is how much money from any pre-need sale that needs to be set aside for future burial costs. Because I think when people are first considering starting a green cemetery, they just do the numbers in a very simplistic format. They're like, okay, every plot's going to be, let's just say $3,000, and we can sell, whatever, 3,000 plots. And they're like, wow, that's so much money, but it's not. Like, what you have to consider with every individual sale is all of the time that's going to go into that relationship. It's not just the time for the burial, it's the time that you spent showing them around, helping them pick their spot, all the time for correspondence over the several years. Like in our case, we offer to do shuttles to the grave for people who are not able-bodied. They can request that, or we'll clear the grave if the family requests it. That takes time. If they want to get a stone, we keep all the stones at our site, and so that takes time. So all that to say is that in addition to the time that you're going to need for your staff to prepare the grave, be there during the burial, and then to maintain the grave site, there's all this other time involved in that relationship. And so when you subtract all of that, it's not as much money as you think. And so you just have to, and this is something I don't think you really can accurately project until you're actually actually operating, because every burial ground operates differently. And so you just kind of have to figure out through experience what the time requirements are in those relationships, and then put a number to that, right? For the different pay that different employees get paid, based on, in our case, if it's a steward clearing or me selling the spot, et cetera. So anyway, I just wanted to add that layer to it, because I think one of our greatest financial responsibilities is for pre-need sales. Some of these folks will not die for 20, 30 years. And we need to have that money set aside for when that time comes. And you might not be selling spots anymore at that point. You might have sold all the available spots. So anyway, that was what I wanted to add, because that's just something we kind of figured out later. And it was like a big, oh, wow, moment for us.
Mhm.
Awesome. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Cassie. We appreciate
Here,
it.
here. Yeah.
So I am, out of respect for everyone's time, we are ending promptly at 6:30. So thank you so much to our presenters. Thank you to everyone who participated. We hope you'll join us for part 2 in September. And please do be in touch with the Conservation Burial Alliance if you have some specific feedback either about tonight's presentation or about things you would like to hear in September or even November's presentations. We would definitely love your feedback so that we can tailor those conversations.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
See you soon.